It's time for more heated debate.
Tonight we're in Chesterfield, and welcome to Question Time. And with us on the panel tonight, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury and former Justice Secretary, Liz Truss. Labour's Shadow Foreign Secretary, former barrister who specialised in human rights law, Emily Thornberry. The leader of the Liberal Democrats, who was Business Secretary during the coalition government with the Conservatives, Vince Cable. And from equity investment to journalism, now a columnist with the Guardian newspaper, Nesreen Malik. And the blogger, broadcaster, former Conservative Party candidate, Ian Dale. And as ever, you can join in the argument on social media using our hashtag BBCQT. Question from Anne Britton, please.
Should children of the Windrush generation be given financial compensation for stresses and hardships suffered?
Financial compensation for what they've been through. Emily Thornberry?
Well, I think the first thing that's got to be said is that the Windrush generation are suffering because of the callousness and the incompetence of this government. I think that in the end, you know, the tone that is set by politicians. And they talked about wanting to introduce a hostile environment for illegal immigration. But they had discussed and they knew that there would be people who were legally here that would be adversely affected. And they cannot say that they've only just found out about this, because I wrote to them a few years ago about one of my constituents who came here as a child and who was here for years, decades. He lost his job. I wrote to the Home Office. I pleaded with them. I said, oh, come on, this is obvious he's British. Why aren't you letting him have his status sorted out? And they refused, and we had to go all the way to court. And only when we got to court did they accept it. I mean, you know here, Junior Green, you know, the man who went home went to where his mum had originally come from. He came here as a babe in arms, and he went back, and because his mum was dying, and then when his mum died, they sent the body back. The British had no problem with the body going back. They just had a problem with the son going back. And so he missed his mother's funeral. I mean, how callous is that?
When this hostile environment, as you put it, was first created, why didn't you vote against it? You abstained on the bill in 2014. Why did you do that?
The point is that...
the point is that. Why did you abstain?
Well, let me answer it. The question was that once the legislation has been brought in, it is the way in which it is applied. There is a great deal of discretion that is available to ministers and to members of staff within the Home Office. And they set the tone, which was this. We have to cut immigration down to tens of thousands. They knew they weren't going to be able to do that because it was free for people to move in about from Europe. And so the only way that they could cut back on immigration was people who came from outside of Europe. And I tell you, it is so difficult for people to come as visitors or to come here from outside of Europe. And that is because they've been chasing this false target that they knew they would never be able to reach. Which is why so many people have ended up having to go to appeal.
I just repeat my question. Jeremy Corbyn, your leader, voted against this legislation. You abstained on it when they said that landlords had to check whether people... You're nodding. Why did you abstain? Why didn't you vote against it if you feel so passionate
Because in
about
principle, I don't have a problem with landlords checking and employers checking.
Right.
What I do have a problem with was that there had been a section which had been in the old legislation, since you asked, in the old legislation, which this new legislation took out. This protection for people from the Commonwealth was taken out in this new legislation. That was the point, and they never consulted on it, and they never announced, but they knew that this is what they were doing, and they knew that they were putting legitimate migrants from the Commonwealth back into this legislation, and that was going to cause them trouble.
All right. Liz Truss.
Well, clearly the situation is incredibly distressing for those people of the Windrush generation. We've all seen the stories, and we are very, very sorry for what has happened. Genuinely sorry, because you can see the optimism which people came to this country, the help that they've given us in terms of fighting in the war, building up this country, and to see people in those situations of distress, whether it's being trapped overseas or in a bureaucratic Kafkaesque nightmare here in Britain is appalling, and we have made a mistake as a government. The Home Secretary has apologised, the Prime Minister has apologised, and we want to do all we can to put it right. We've set up the unit, David, and that will help the children of the Windrush generation as well as the Windrush generation. We want to help with financial losses that might have taken place. There's some terrible stories.
You want to help with? The question was,
with financial losses.
Will you get financial
Absolutely.
compensation for stress and hardship and presumably legal costs, charges on the NHS, being thrown out of your house, all those things that may have happened to
We
these
will
people?
absolutely look sympathetically at those cases, because I am very concerned. Like, there was an unfortunate gentleman who had been a teaching assistant in his 60s, lost his job as a result of actions by the government. And we do think that those people do deserve to be properly compensated for the losses they've suffered. It was wrong what happened. It was very, very wrong, and we are sorry.
But you were warned.
Nazreen Malik.
Well, I think it's completely bizarre that all these politicians who have voted for these acts continuously over the past 8 years, in 2010, in 2012, in 2014, and in 2016, to suddenly be bemused as to how it all happened. We can't carve out the Windrush generation and then decide that because that's happened and we've given them financial compensation, then there is no problem. There is a fundamental infrastructural cruelty that has started in 2010 when David Cameron decided that the Tory party can become the nasty party once more. And I think that this whole, we're sorry, it was a mistake, it was a snafu, it was a bureaucratic error, it was an unintended consequence, is a cop-out. The buck stops with Theresa May, who began the hostile environment in 2012, and this will not go away with financial compensation.
I think genuinely the situation is terrible, but it makes a pleasant change for any politician to say, put their hands up, say sorry. Words are cheap. What we now need to know is see the actions that are taken to address the situation.
Absolutely right.
But the Labour Party, political point scoring, you should be ashamed of yourselves. If it were that bad, you knew it was going to be that bad, like you're claiming now, you should have voted against it.
Vince Cable.
Well, actually, I agree with the gentleman in blue. I mean, there is a lot of political point scoring. The fact is we all, in the political world, have some responsibility for this. I mean, the process of becoming increasingly intimidating on immigration policy, it started the early days of the Labour government. If you remember Jack Straw, David Blunkett, they felt there was a public mood hostile, and they became tougher and tougher. In my government, we indeed adopted this ludicrous immigration target. Some of us spent 5 years fighting it, but yeah, I mean, I voted for some of this legislation as part of a compromise, so have some responsibility for it, and of course it continues to this day. But I think bringing it back very specifically to the Windrush generation, there are 50,000 people, many of them insecure. They've got to be given proper security and basis for staying here. But the problem goes much wider than that. The problem goes much wider than that. I mean, just to give one very simple example, one of my constituents is a woman who's been here all her adult life, Jamaican origin, dying of cancer within probably the next few weeks. And she wants her common law husband, who's Jamaican, in Jamaica, to come and spend the last few weeks and months of her life so she's cared for. And they will not let her in. You know, and this is the default position when you're dealing with compassionate cases of this kind, and there are many, many of them, visitors, is always to say no. And this culture has been built up over many years, and it's because the politicians of all our parties have believed that that's what the public want. And I think one of the genuinely good things to come out of this is the outpouring of genuine decency from the public and an outrage that this has happened. And I think this is a very good check on everybody in politics that we've just got to change the emphasis. Of course, immigration needs to be managed and controlled. We all accept that. But it's got to be done in a proportionate and humane way. And at the moment, it isn't.
just wonder how the government's going to deal with people who die because of this. I believe a gentleman died the day before he received his letter to say he could stay in the country. How do you compensate for that? How's the government going to compensate for that?
Indo.
The problem is that we have a racist immigration system in this country. And Vince's example there, if that person had been from New Zealand, I have absolutely no doubt that they would have been allowed to come in.
Yeah,
and I think that's something that any government has got to get a grip with. But to go back to Anne's question, should people receive compensation? Well, the lady's right. For some people, it's too late. The Guardian, the journalist who uncovered all of this, Amelia Gentleman, Nazreen's colleague on The Guardian, she wrote about a man, I apologise if I've got his name wrong, but I think it was Dexter Bristol, who died because of the psychological pressures that were put on him by this system, where he wasn't able to get his papers. He lost his job because his employer couldn't keep him in the job because of the evidence. But you see, part of the problem here is that we talk about groups, we talk about immigrants, we talk about asylum seekers, we talk about refugees, and we lose sight of the fact that every single person within that group is an individual human being. And when, as a government, you start using language like a hostile environment, you say it's to deter illegal immigrants. A lot of people don't look at the word illegal, they just see the word immigrant. So you create an atmosphere of hostility. And then the next stage is that you send vans around North London with "Go Home" written on them and urging people to dob people in. Now, I don't know if you know how many people were actually sent home as a result of those vans.
Yeah,
11. Now, was that really worth it for the fact that all the anguish that it caused, not just people who may have been here illegally, but people who were here quite legally? And the final point on this, I would say, is if you were an EU national now, and I've spent the last 18 months trying to persuade EU nationals who phone into my radio show telling me that they're worried about their settled status. I've tried to persuade them, no, of course you'll be fine. Well, you look at this, and if I was from one of the EU countries, I would be feeling quite nervous at this point.
Now let me just bring it back to the politicians, because it's been pointed out today that on Question Time, way back in 2004, Theresa May appeared in a debate about immigration. This is what she said: "I'm actually sick and tired of government ministers who simply blame other people when something goes wrong." Does this mean heads should roll, do you think, in this case, rather than blaming the Home Office, blaming the border agency?
Well, in this case, both the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary have apologised. They have taken responsibility for the decisions that have been made and the way the system is worked. And that is right, because ultimately civil servants answer to ministers. It's ultimately ministers' responsibility. The Home Secretary has acted to set up this unit to help people. And I just want to give the message out that if anybody is concerned about their status, it is very important they get in touch. They will get a sympathetic hearing.
Okay.
I just wonder how bad it has to get. Listen, I mean, I've resigned in the past. It's really painful. But I do think you do need to take responsibility. We have heard that there have been people not able to attend their mother's funeral. We have heard that people have died. We have heard that people have worked in the National Health Service and then suddenly weren't allowed to even get the assistance of the National Health Service later. We have heard the most terrible circumstances. And you know, sir, when you said that we knew, we did not know. That was the point. Was that they took this protection out of the legislation and they didn't consult on it and they didn't announce it.
Your government was using the same kind of language.
We didn't.
Yes, you did.
Hello?
John Reid, when
Go
he was,
home vans?
No, John Reid, when he was Home Secretary, he was talking about making it much more difficult for people who were here illegally. Alan Johnson actually used the phrase hostile environment. So don't just blame...
I'm not going to...
Don't talk over him. The words got muddled. Alan Johnson said
Alan
what?
Johnson was the first one to use the words hostile environment. That was Home Office language.
Labour, not
back
Tory.
before the Tories started. But it doesn't really matter, Tory Labour here. If Liz Truss was in your position, she would be saying exactly the same as you. And if you were in her position, you would be saying exactly the same as her.
Man in blue there. Yeah.
when you lose your house, when you lose your job, when you can't get NHS service, sorry, it's just not good enough. It's how we saw action, both from Labour and Conservatives, because it's just words at the moment.
OK, and the woman here on the left, you.
Just going back to what Vince said about the issue with the immigration, my sister is married to a gentleman from South Africa. They have a child together, and she's actually got to emigrate to South Africa next month. And it devastates me that my little sister and my niece are not going to be in this country anymore because they've applied, they've been denied. He has to he had to appeal to be able to come into the country to watch his daughter be born. And I don't see how is that right? That you know, families are being split up over this, and I know it's not the the direct point that they started on, but is this ever going to change?
OK, and the woman there in the fourth row. Yes.
In any other business or industry, if it was in a school, someone who's made such a catastrophic error of judgment would be forced to resign. And I think this is where we're at now. If you're apologising and saying sorry and saying it was a mistake, then you need to go. And it's quite simple.
All right. Yes, behind.
To be honest, I wouldn't trust Theresa May to run a bath, let alone run this country. So she's an absolute disgrace. I never thought I'd agree with a Tory minister, to be honest with you.
I'm not a minister.
Or someone that stood as a Tory MP, but I think this goes deeper to the heart of the issue. This government and the Tories just don't give a monkeys about the working class.
And take one more point from you in the second row there.
Vince Cable talked about an outpouring of decency from the public. It would be novel, wouldn't it, if we could see something similar from our politicians and the leaders of our country.
Okay. Well, let's go on. We've got many... What do you want to say?
I just wanted to say that I think that everyone would agree that we need to have a fair and a firm and a fast immigration policy. We need to have decisions made clearly so that we know who is allowed into the country and who is not allowed into the country, and we need to make sure that we enforce it. But we should do it in a way that does not take away people's common sense. If you do it within the context of that we want to have a hostile environment, that we want go-home vans, people pick up those signals, and that is when people start being treated badly.
We're going to go on. We've got other questions, obviously. Just before we do, we're going to be in Bury St Edmunds next Thursday. The week after that in St Albans. There on the bottom of the screen are the ways to apply. What did you say?
I say it's next door to my constituency, Bury St Edmunds.
Oh.
So you could have invited me next week, David.
No. Thank you for coming.
You probably wish you had.
Katrina McIntosh, let's have your question, please.
Are the people of Syria any safer since the recent airstrikes?
Vince Cable.
Probably a bit, but not very much. My attitude towards this was my criticism of government, that they didn't come to Parliament and debate this properly. But when I debated it in Parliament, I took the view, if only been asked, I would probably have agreed to it, because I think when you have a government quite systematically and cynically using chemical weapons against civilians, I think we can't just let it pass. But on the essence of your question, are they safer? I think the Syrian authorities may well have been deterred for a while. But the really alarming thing about this problem, I mean, when I looked it up, I discovered that over the last 5 years, chemical weapons had been used over 200 times in Syria, but nobody had responded to that. They used them on a weekly basis, quite systematically, cynically, because it works in that brutal, atrocious war. And I fear that, if this happens again, we're going to be faced with the same question. Do we bomb again, or do we stand back? And I think it would have been so much wiser and more sensible if the government had actually come to Parliament and got a proper mandate and explained through us to you why this was ultimately necessary.
Let's leave the parliamentary point, because we may come to that, but let's just deal for the moment with the actual question of the efficacy of what was done. Yes, you in the red shirt up there.
I'm just wondering when we're going to start and learn from these foreign interventions. For example, look at what happened after we intervened in the Libya conflict. We left a right mess behind. And it seems that we're making the same mistakes over and over again.
I think so. That's an extremely understandable point of view. But just because you get things wrong in one of these missions, that doesn't mean to say that you get it wrong all the time. We can look back to Sierra Leone, can look back to Kosovo, and plenty of other cases where intervention... Yes, of course, Iraq got wrong. I totally agree with you on that. But, well, Afghanistan, you might be able to argue that one. But there are plenty of occasions when Britain and the international community have intervened to good effect. To answer Katrina's question, the answer is yes. I think that if it is the case that Assad's ability to launch a chemical weapons attack has been diminished, I won't say eradicated, because I don't think that's probably possible, but if so, I think that is a good thing. Now, back in 2013, when Obama set his red lines and Parliament had a vote on that, I would not have voted for action then, but I think I was wrong, and I think Parliament got it wrong in 2013. I think the reasons that Theresa May has given are entirely convincing, unless you are some sort of Russian conspiracy theorist who believes that it was Britain that launched this chemical attack, which, I mean, really. I think sometimes the international community has to act. Now, it was proportionate. There were clear objectives. And my criteria for whether I could support this intervention was whether the government could show that there were clear objectives. Because I don't believe in gesture bombing. Some of us might feel better about punishing Assad, but what does that actually achieve? But there were clear objectives here to diminish Assad's chemical weapons capability. They were surgical strikes in 3 areas where we thought that he had chemical weapons factories. No one was killed, no one was even injured. So I think that it was one of those occasions where international intervention actually worked.
Okay.
I think, to answer your question, I think probably they're safer for the next 2-3 days. I don't see how this is going to be a fundamental change of how things happen in Syria. If Syrian citizens are not going to be gassed, they're going to be bombed, or they're going to be shelled, or they're going to be arrested and tortured. And I think my issue with this is that it's always framed in terms of, is foreign intervention good or bad? And in a situation like Syria, which is so messy, and which has actually, to be fair to the government, has changed dramatically over the past 7 years. The entrance of ISIS made things unpredictable, the alliance with Iran and Russia has made things messy. I don't think it's helpful to speak of things in terms of should we intervene or should we not intervene. The most important thing is to have a strategy. If you're not intervening, have a strategy for not intervening that involves sanctions, engaging with allies, punishing Iran and Russia, having a robust humanitarian effort and taking in refugees. That's fine. If you are going to intervene, don't do it piecemeal and randomly without parliamentary consultation to make you feel better because you saw some children foaming at the mouth. Children are dying every day.
Yes.
We're not the world's policemen. We need to stop these foreign interventions. It's getting us nowhere and it's causing us more trouble. We've seen this over the past 15 years.
So you're against this one, obviously?
Yes, absolutely.
And any intervention?
Not necessarily any intervention, but there never seems to be an end goal. There never seems to be, what do we want to achieve out of this?
But there was here, that's the point.
Hang on, Emily Thornton.
No.
Do you want to answer him?
If they use chemical weapons again, what do? Do we bomb them again?
Emily?
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think the point is this, the history of the last 20 years of military interventions has been quite clear that we have not had a strategy, there has not been a plan, and we just need to look at what has happened in other countries. And quite frankly, there is a humanitarian disaster going on in Syria. The only country worse than that, frankly, is Yemen. And there is no strategy as to how to deal with that problem. So let's park that. So that's the answer to, are Syrians going to be safer tonight? No, they're not. The question was, how do we, that we had to deal with the issue of using chemical weapons. Now, the Chemical Weapons Convention was something that the whole world agreed to, that we had to move on, that it was about time we stopped using chemical weapons. And then we start seeing them being used, so what do? We decide that we're going to a few of us are going to unilaterally decide that we're going to decide that's not right, we're going to do something about it. What we needed to do, and I was at the Security Council when we had the first discussion, and what was happening was that the Americans on the one hand were saying, you know, of course it was the Russians or the Assad who were responsible for these chemicals, and the Russians were saying there were no chemicals used at all. baseline, which they all agreed on, let's send in the investigators so there is no argument. So it was quite clear. Listen, whatever my personal opinion is... Whatever my personal opinion is...
This is over a week ago. Nobody's gone in yet.
There are weapon inspectors in Damascus, and they are going in, and what they need to do...
Sorry, when are they going in to...
What they need to do... Please, can I just finish this bit? What they need to do is they need to prove that the chemical weapons were used, and that is the baseline, and that is where we start. Because, do you know what? I want Assad prosecuted for this, and if he's going to be prosecuted, we need to have evidence that everyone can agree on.
Can you just explain why, in that case, these inspectors have not been allowed in? They've been day after day. They're going in today, they're going in tomorrow, they've not gone in.
From what I understand is that there is a huge amount of red tape, safety planning, blah, 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 within the UN as to what they need to be able to pass all of this before people are out. Of course, they should have gone in earlier. And do you know what? One of the reasons that it isn't safe is because there's been a bombing from Assad and then also bombing from the Americans.
Won't let them in. That's the truth.
I can answer the question. The Russians have stopped the weapons inspectors coming in. Yeah. The Russians have blocked...
Let us see.
The Russians have blocked action on the Security Council. They have stopped action being taken. And the reality is that these dreadful chemical weapons that have been used to flush out innocent citizens from their homes in Syria have been backed not just by the Assad regime, but also Russia has turned a blind eye, and Russia is on the Security Council. And I don't think we can stand by and allow Russia to flout international law, as they did also in a different way in Salisbury, and allow these weapons to be used, on which there has been a ban for 100 years. And I just wanted to respond to the point made in the audience. I think there's a big difference between seeking to change a regime, which was the objective, for example, of the Iraq War, and what we are doing here, which is protecting the international order and protecting that ban on chemical weapons, which are so egregious. And Russia, frankly, is a rogue state that has been allowed to do this. And if we don't put a stop to it, if we don't call it out...
But the question is, you say the Russians are breaking international law, and you break international law in order to enforce it.
You must allow people to speak so they're heard, and I'll bring you in. But if you interrupt all the time, people... You're not interrupting all the time.
I'm really not. The point I'm trying to...
Right, all right. Even if you weren't interrupting, I want to get to Nazreen.
I'd like to make a very brief point. If Labour does not believe in intervention, they should just own that, rather than peddle all these conspiracy theories or indulge the fact that someone used chemical weapons but it wasn't Assad. Just say, we don't believe in international intervention, and stand your ground on that. But to contribute to this really unhelpful view that weapons inspectors haven't found anything, that someone used chemical weapons but we don't know who they are, there's very clear footage, there's testimony on the ground. Chemical weapons have been used in Syria. If you don't believe that that is a cause for international intervention, that is fine. Just own it.
Now say it.
Thank you.
Is she right?
Of course there has to be international action when chemical weapons are used. And I would suggest that when it is a breach of international law, the way to enforce it is not by, Liz, breaching international law ourselves. What we need to do is we need to be able to act collectively, and what we do first is we prove that those chemical weapons have been used in a way which is to a standard that no one can argue about. I may have my personal views. I may think they use that they may have used chemical weapons, but the point is that it needs to be proved so that we can have the international community acting as one.
But
because if we had...
The Russians won't let the inspectors
please, guys. Honestly, you tell me I interrupt. I've been interrupted 3 or 4 times whilst I'm trying to get a sentence out.
We can double it. This is serious stuff.
It is serious stuff.
And you appear to be saying that we have to do something which According to Liz Truss, the Russians prevent ever happening.
Well,
Inspectors
first of
going into Duma for a start.
first of all, I don't accept what she says about the Russians stopping it. My understanding, my understanding is that it's a United Nations problem with their red tape and their safety, and they're getting their safety stuff through to. And I mean, listen, you know, that is what I'm told.
Today?
But I tell you what. I was at the Security Council, and the Russians accepted that these chemical weapons inspectors needed to go in, and if there had been a Security Council resolution about that phase 1, there would have been unanimity at the Security Council. We would then need to negotiate how we then looked at how we proved who was responsible for using those chemical weapons, and that was really important, and that needed to be done next. But what I want in the end, Ian, is I want effective international action so that we can protect people against the use of chemical weapons.
Why won't you give us...
I
promise I will. Why won't you give us your personal opinion as to who was responsible for this? We've all done it. Why can't you?
My personal opinion is that Assad was responsible for gassing these kids, and I want him to go to court. So I want to make sure that we have strong evidence so that we can get him to court.
The flaw in your argument is that the OPCW, they will not attribute blame. They will go in and say there was a chemical attack, and they'll say...
Exactly, that's why I was saying you do it in 2 phases. The OPCW does phase 1, and then you have a Jim that does phase 2.
I'm going to the audience now. Thank you. The woman there in the second row.
I would say, whilst I applaud the action if we have truly removed the risk of chemical weapons against the people of Syria, I also can't help but observe that we've had one conversation talking about the importance of protecting the rights of people from the Commonwealth, and then another when we've moved on to saying that we shouldn't be intervening because they're foreigners.
The man up there on the gangway.
I'm so sick of people saying that we can't intervene because every intervention is a disaster. I had friends in Syria who watched every month. Do you remember those videos of people beheading other people? Those have disappeared. Do you know why? Because of Western-backed Peshmerga in Kurdistan who have wiped out ISIS, and they're on the run. They're not finished, but they're on the run. Those people can thank Western airstrikes, targeted, proportionate airstrikes like we did. It's not a regime change. And people like Diane Abbott and Jeremy Corbyn, who will be in charge of our security, by the way, she'll be Home Secretary and he'll be Prime Minister. They voted twice against ISIL airstrikes. Twice. Go look it up, don't take my word for it.
The woman in the second row, 2 in there, yes.
How can we trust the findings of the weapons inspectors when the Russians have now been in charge and policing that area for the last 10 days?
It's difficult, but you know, but the US Secretary of State, right, James Mattis said the day before the bombing, he said we don't have any definitive evidence, we only have social media indicators. So I'm just saying we do need to do the best we can to get as strong as evidence that we can, so that we get the international community to step up and do its job and make sure that we don't ever see these weapons used again.
The man there in the third row.
That's what I said, Secretary of State.
You in the third row from the back, yes.
Emily, I think you're giving the Russians too much respect. Do you not think, surely, that it's absolutely possible that they've said one thing to you and they're doing something completely different behind closed doors?
OK, and I want to go... I take that as a rhetorical question. You in the third row from the back, yes.
Ian, I'm a fan of yours, but when you say these are conspiracy theories, I haven't seen any evidence that makes me believe that Assad did this. Assad has no motive for doing this.
Well, let me tell you.
Hang on, Ian. Don't jump in. Let him speak.
He's basically won the civil war. What has he got to gain by bringing America and us into this? He's basically won the war. Why would he do it? And I don't really trust the government.
All right, and the woman here, we'll come back to these points. The woman here.
I'm glad, Emily, you pointed out about the UN and a resolution, but I refuse to believe that with Russia on the Security Council, that any resolution's going to happen. They have continuously in the past blocked any solution. If we're going to have peace in Syria, we need to readdress Russia's position in international relations.
Vince Cable.
Yes, I thought the question raised at the back was a very important one, which is about what Assad's motives were. And they were very clear that this horrible way of conducting war works. The day after they used the gas attack, a struggle that had been going on for weeks, the opposition collapsed. Now, this isn't just an issue about recent history. It matters for the future. There are big concentrations now of civilians in other parts of the country, Idlib is the most important, who will be attacked next. And the regime will use gas and nerve agents if they can get away with it. And that's why we have to have, the government has to have a proper mandate and a clear strategy as to deal with it when it comes up in future. My worry, which hasn't been mentioned at all, is actually about the American side of all this. I mean, you've got a president who switches attention from one day to the other, is more preoccupied with Stormy Daniels than he is with President Assad, and more seriously, has now brought into his government people who want to extend the conflict to Iran, with all the consequences that would have. So it is absolutely imperative now that the government has a very clearly defined definition of when do we intervene next, if we intervene. What's the threshold? Because gas will be used again and again.
What's the strategy afterwards?
And
That was always
afterwards,
the
we
mistake.
then need to have, I think, basically two things. We need then to get involved in the peace process. It's currently just Russia and Turkey and Iran. They're the only countries involved. And we need to make it very clear this is a wider obligation. And I think the other thing is humanitarian assistance. You know, we're still dealing with millions of refugees. Some of them have been in camps for years. I mean, our own record, to be frank, in dealing with child refugees is appalling. You know, we talk about humanitarian intervention. A very simple humanitarian gesture, and we haven't done it.
All right. I'm going to move on because we've only got 20 minutes to go and we've got other things to talk about. And we come back home with a question from David Saunders, please. Mr. Saunders.
In light of the surge in knife crime, do the panel think the use of stop and search should be increased?
The use of stop and search, the numbers have dropped over between 2017, before that, the numbers have been falling. Fall of 20%, I think, Liz Truss would know, on stop and search. And knife crime has been rising, particularly in London, where in 100 days there were a person killed every other day, knifed to death. So, should stop and search use be increased? Nesreen, what's your view?
I think we're the tail's wagging the dog here with stop and search. The reason why knife crime has increased is because of a correlation between lack of policing and cutting policing budgets, and the sense that there is a way that you can get away with a crime with impunity. I think we're wasting time talking about how we can search young men, mostly in environments where there is a lot of tension. So why would you increase racial tension? Why would you damage community relations? Why would you put a community at odds with the police? And I think that I'm always fascinated by how governments manage to divert the conversation from how we got here in the first place to how can we fix this. We can fix this by finding out how we got here in the first place and sorting that out. Even things, even minor crimes like snatching iPhones from people as they're standing on the side of the street have risen dramatically in big cities because it is known that there is no policing resource that will waste its time on kids on bikes. And so that's a very small example of how communities are very sensitive and very attuned to how much policing there is in a neighborhood. So instead of talking about a solution which is going to inflame tensions further, and I think this is the most important thing, put a community at odds with the police, work on creating more goodwill, work on creating a larger police force that can engage with the community, ask them what is needed, then frisk young boys going home from school.
All right. David Saunders, what do you make of that answer?
I sort of agree with it, but I think that we just need to get the knives off the street, and if that means stopping people and taking them from them, then I'd go that way.
So I don't get that. So you agree with it? You think it's potentially perilous, but actually a good thing to do? You take the risk?
I think it's so bad at the minute, and it's getting worse, that we need to get the knives off the street.
Ian Dale.
Only 8% of stop and searches are knife crime related. The overwhelming majority are drug related. I think there is an argument for increasing stop and searches as long as they're targeted in particular areas, but I kind of think it misses the point. The point here is that there's got to be a long-term approach, and it's not just about policing, it's also about public health. And I learnt a new phrase the other day, which is a really horrific phrase. It's called gang grooming, where kids as young as the age of 11 or 12 are groomed into gang life. They're often kids that have very few male role models in their lives, and they're just sucked into this kind of life. And I've talked to so many former gang members on my radio show who phone in and tell me how they got out of it. And they're only in their 20s when they realise that what they're doing is really very wrong. And by that time, of course, I only talk to the ones who are not in prison, but there will be a lot who are in prison. And what we need to do here is learn from cities where they've actually tackled this problem. And Glasgow appears to be one city that has tackled this problem, where they've had an integrated approach to solving gang crime, and they go into schools. It's seen as a public health approach. And
What you're saying, the knife crime is falling in Glasgow, rising in London?
Absolutely. Glasgow used to be the knife crime capital of the United Kingdom. It no longer is. There are reasons for that. I interviewed Neville Lawrence, the father of Stephen Lawrence, who was murdered, I think it's 25 years ago on Sunday. And I mean, what a calm, serene man he is. He's actually forgiven his son's killers. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't think I would be quite as charitable.
Liz Truss.
So I very much agree with what Ian is saying about early intervention. You know, we need to look at the root causes. We need to make sure that we are intervening before youngsters join gangs. We're seeing a very worrying spread across the UK in terms of county lines of grooming gang members to go into rural parts of the country, small towns, and part of that is making sure that those young people have the alternatives, that they have the opportunities, the apprenticeships, the career paths, rather than joining a gang. Now, on stop and search, I do think it is a part of what we need to be doing. And in fact, Cressida Dick has recently said that she wants to see more of it used in London, but it does have to be used in line with the law. And I think what was happening before is people were being targeted because of their ethnicity. That was wrong. And what we have seen in the way stop and search is now being used is it is achieving a higher arrest rate. It's done on the basis of, is there genuine suspicion around that individual?
Drugs, not knife
crime.
But
eight times more black people are searched, or stopped and searched, than white people.
But
is that balanced, reasonable and fair?
Well, what the police are doing in the way that they, in general, investigate crime is they're using more risk-based evidence. They're looking at what are the leads rather than just randomly going and stopping and searching people. They are, and I've been out with Norfolk Constabulary, I've seen the way they use technology now, and they are taking a more proportionate response.
I think it's a very long-winded way of saying it's racial profiling, but there we are.
It's racial profiling.
It's racial
I don't,
profiling.
that isn't, I dispute that.
Numbers speak for
I
themselves.
dispute that, David. What the police are doing is they are using evidence, they are using ways of using, for example, one of the issues we've got is social media and people boasting about the crimes they might be committing or the weapons they might have on social media. And that's the type of information the police use to be able to intervene.
You're Chief Secretary to the Treasury. You're in charge of the nation's finances. If we're going to have this long-term approach, it is going to require extra investment. Are you going to provide it?
And one of the things I am very keen to do is make sure that we are using our money earlier in people's lives rather than waiting till the problem occurs, actually taking those long-term decisions, say, for example, investing in early education, which we know raises people's chances of getting a good job in later life.
She doesn't actually dish the money out. The Chancellor does that, doesn't he?
She does, actually.
Well,
do you do it?
I dish low levels of money out, David.
Do you?
Yes.
What kind of sums do you dish out?
Billions,
well,
billions.
Not any to Question Time or the BBC.
What? Man up there.
Or me?
Yes.
Oh, I was going to say, please, Liz, can we have some money then? Because Youth centres used to be there. They've been cut. Sure Start has been cut. In Chesterfield, we've gone from a multitude of centres to just a few, and they're going to be cut even further. And as an early years practitioner, my money has been cut and cut and cut some more. So yes, if you want your early intervention, please, please, please give us the money for those of us that are there to do it, to do our jobs.
Well The question was about crime and knife crime. Do you see a correlation between the cuts in the funding you have and a rise in crime in Chesterfield?
Well, as just a basic early years person, I can only count to 5, but I would say as the money has gone down and all our provision has gone down, our crime in general and the knife crime has gone up. There are people there that have the skills, that have the will, if we could get out there and have the funding to do that.
Liz, just
Can I just respond to that? We are putting more money into childcare.
I can't see it, I'm sorry.
Before 2010, there was no entitlement for 2-year-olds on a low income. They now get 15 hours a week of free childcare, which is very important.
Don't, because
for 3 and I just want to respond to your point. For 3 and 4-year-olds, for working parents, there is now 30 hours a week available, and we have put in the funding, and in fact we're putting in record funding into childcare, £6 billion a year.
Well, can I explain where that funding goes?
Okay.
Because you're saying about the early years, you tell everybody it's 33 hours, but you don't put in the little proviso, it's term time only. The amount of parents I've had to speak to and have heated conversations, because you said it's 30 hours, they think they get that every week of the year,
all
so
right,
they can go
well,
to they don't.
All right, let's go.
That's just one example.
All right,
of where
let's go back. Let's leave that for the moment. Go back to the question which was about knife crime. You in the 4th row, you sir.
You say that you're going to educate children, and I'm guessing that you're wanting to bring this in at a school level, but you've just said then that all the money that you're piling into it are going to younger children. You said Sure Start, that's 2 years old, that's people that are still at nursery. You're not going to educate those children about gangs and things. It's going to come through at primary schools, it's going to come through at secondary schools,
right.
and it's all of these places where you're taking the money.
Emily
I think it's generally accepted that at about the age of 11 or 12, that whilst kids may love their mum and dad, they're looking for other adults. They're looking for another role model outside the home. And if they don't have it by way of doing sport or in a youth club or anything else, they will go to their friends, and that's where they will find their alternative world. And that's why youth work is absolutely vital. Can I make another point, though, which is this. We can only speak from our own experience, and I represent an inner London constituency, and we have had terrible, terrible deaths as a result of knife crime. I write too many letters to grieving mothers. I know far too much about this. And there was a time when we had so many of these knife attacks that, frankly, kids who wouldn't normally even be carrying a knife started carrying them because they were afraid that other people were carrying them. And in those circumstances, I wholeheartedly agreed with what the police did next. Over a period of 2 weeks, they literally randomly, they stopped young people, and they stopped them randomly. They didn't do any racial profiling. They stopped everybody, and they searched them to make sure they weren't carrying knives. And they searched the parks. There were people hiding knives in the parks, and we had to stop it. And over that period of a couple of weeks, people then knew that they couldn't. And I then looked at the stats, and I spoke to my borough commander, and she had sat down with the cops beforehand and said, you're going to do this, you're going to be talking to all sorts of kids, you must do it respectfully, but you must do it firmly, we do not want any incidents, be careful, be polite, say thank you. And when we looked at what the racial background was of the kids who had been stopped, it did match exactly who was in my constituency during the day. And it was good. And it worked.
All right. You, sir. Yes.
I think there needs to be a twofold approach. I think actually some of the answers are quite similar to what we're talking about Syria. There needs to be a long-term strategy, education, and all the rest of the things that you're talking about, but sometimes there needs to be a short, sharp shock. And if stop and search or some other tactic stops people from being killed tonight, tomorrow, the day afterwards, then that's what we should do.
Vince Cable.
Yes, I think Ian made the correct point at the beginning, that actually the stop and search argument is beside the point. I mean, what is happening, it's particularly true in London, but it's true in other big cities in varying degrees, is you've got a big upsurge in the drug trade. What is happening is that primary school children are now being used to carry the drugs because they're relatively unobservable. We're dealing with the problem of guns as well as knives. And in order to deal with these things, I mean, it's a mixture. It's partly a resources question, but the question is how you do the resources. And I think the most important thing, actually, is having police on the streets. They've largely disappeared in many areas. And it's not just your police officers, it's the police support officers as well, because they're around there, they're talking to people, they're picking up gossip, they're picking up information. And once you destroy that infrastructure, you're much more vulnerable to the gangs taking over, and that is essentially what's now happening.
Okay, a couple more points, then we'll take a last question. Yes, the woman there in the second row, and I'll come to you.
I used to live in London, and I know there's a gang culture there. I just say I think it's down to bringing it down to community level, so it's knowing what others know, bring it together, and then tackle the crime through talking to the gangs or but offering them different alternatives like sports and other things.
Okay, and the woman here on the left.
This is something quite personal to me. I witnessed the aftermath of a stabbing when I was in London a couple of months back, and it was horrendous. But I think I agree with Vince, and I agree with you that it is about policing, and it is about, we can't racially profile people because it is going to lead to the riots we had in Croydon a few years back. It was awful. We can't fight hate with more hate, and that's what like racially profiling is going to bring.
Can I just add very briefly? I think with things like knife crime, it's very similar to the Windrush generation scandal, is that these things are the culmination of years of policies. So whether it's the rise in gang crime and knife crime, whether it is the doubling of homeless deaths over the past 5 years, whether it's the increasingly punitive attitude towards undocumented migrants and illegal migrants, this is a culmination of years of austerity, of callousness, withdrawing, as a government, withdrawing from our communities and withdrawing from the ability to see people as individuals as opposed to corporate individuals that need to be managed.
Okay. We've got 5 minutes left. We go back to politics and Westminster and take a question from Andy Newick, please. Andy Newick.
Do the panel feel the Labour Party is two parties living under one roof and is divorce imminent?
Is the Labour Party two parties living under one roof? I'll come to you, Emily, but not immediately. and is divorce imminent? Ian Dale, what's your take on that?
Look, all successful political parties are big tent coalitions. Ronald Reagan in 1980 won the election because he attracted huge numbers of Democratic voters over to him. Margaret Thatcher won a huge majority in 1983 because she attracted huge numbers of former Labour voters over to vote Conservative because of the council house sales. Bill Clinton did the same thing. Tony Blair did the same thing. I mean, brilliantly, Tony Blair attracted people who previously could not consider voting Labour. So all political parties are big.
OK, so can we come to where we are now?
Well, where we are now is that the Labour Party is at least two parties, if not three or four. And Emily has been incredibly successful in making the transition to being a Jeremy Corbyn supporter. And I mean, she's been on Question Time, I think, more than anybody else in the shadow cabinet because she is the human face of Corbynism. But I don't think there's going to be a divorce. Politics is very tribal. It takes a lot for someone to leave their own party. I think there are one or two that might be on the verge of it. But where are they going to go? They're not going to cross the floor to the Conservatives. We're hearing that rich people have got £50 million for a new party. Well, Vince was a founder member of the SDP, I think, back in the day. That went well, didn't it?
OK, Vince Cable. Vince.
Yes, I mean, I think that you know, there are deep fissures in the Labour Party. It's very obvious, actually, when you're in the House of Commons. We've had in the last few weeks the argument about the Salisbury murder, we've had Syria, we've had anti-Semitism. And what is almost embarrassing is the way that large numbers of Labour MPs now publicly disown their own leader. And they do it very vocally, very openly, and the important question, actually, is what they're going to do about it. I mean, most of them are just sitting tight, waiting for something to happen. It may be that Brexit will be the trigger. I don't know.
What's Emily doing, in your view?
Well, I think Ian's comments were fair. But the question...
That's twice you've agreed
But
with me
I mean,
tonight.
I have some experience of this. I mean, as has been pointed out, I was in the last Labour Civil War. I was a Labour councillor in Glasgow, as it happened. That's where I started. And I was actually quite happy in the Labour Party until the extreme left took over, particularly in London. And I finished up in the SDP, now leader of the party of which it's part. It's been a part success, but the problem is that the British system is really designed for two parties, or two and a half in my case, and it's very, very difficult for a breakaway group to succeed under the British voting system, and that's why many of them hang back. But if there was any kind of political logic, they would leave, because they're fundamentally incompatible, fundamentally different values and ideologies.
We have to speed up, because we've only got a couple of minutes left. Emily Thornberry, fundamentally different ideologies.
Let's start with the manifesto. We're at the anniversary of Theresa May calling a snap election. And what the Labour Party discovered was that we agree with each other. And we put our agreement in a manifesto that was anti-austerity, that was about greater fairness in our country. It was a truly internationalist manifesto. And we said, we agree on this. And politics is all about how you change people's lives. It's about how you change people's lives, and it's the policies which is what is important, and that is what unites us. And we are a party of 600,000. And when the next election is called, we are going to win. We are going to win.
Liz Truss.
As long as we remain united behind the
main
manifesto, we will win the next election.
You've said
we will
that
show
already.
that there is hope and there is another way. It does not have to be like this.
Liz Truss.
The fact is, the main people's lives, the Labour Party seem to be trying to change as each other's. They're desperately trying to deselect MPs in seats across the country or council leaders. And when I look across to the opposition benches, I see people constantly eye-rolling, sighing, and I just say, file the divorce papers, for God's sake. Leave them! Leave them!
Brief if you would. I'm sorry to say be brief, but we are...
No, I'll be brief. I think the real tragedy here is, where do Labour voters go? I mean, we can't go to the Lib Dems because their soul was stolen in the coalition. And it's really painful to see this fight, because the Conservatives need an effective opposition. So, as someone who cares very much about the values of Labour, I just want to say, please get it together.
All right. Okay. Our hour's up. Apologies to those who have your hands in the air still. Come back next time. It's the first time we've been in Chesterfield, but I've no doubt after tonight we'll be coming back quite soon, because it's great. Next week we're going to be in Bury St Edmunds. I hope we'll be well received there. And then we've got Diane Abbott there, Caroline Lucas. We've got Matt Hancock, the new Culture Secretary, on that programme. Week after that, it's St Albans. 0330 123 9988 is the number to call if you want to ring or apply on the website, which is down there on the screen. If you want to go on talking about some of these things, Adrian Childs on Question Time Extra Time on 5 Live now carries on the debate. But from Chesterfield here, my thanks to our panel and to all of you who came to take part. Until next Thursday. From Question Time, good night.
Talking about the bombing in Syria, putting morality in the spotlight and reviewing the political week with Richard Madeley. This week follows next here on BBC One.